If you had to guess between these two sweaters, which one you thought was crocheted and which one you thought was knit, which one would you say is which? Well, before we get to the answer, I'm going to unpack the difference between knitting versus crocheting in terms of lifetime cost of supplies, how long it takes to do either, what yarn you need to knit or crochet, the physical difference, so how does it actually feel between a knit versus crochet garment, the variety of items that you can make doing either, and how to get started. If you're thinking of picking up either crocheting or knitting and you've come here to learn more about both to make your decision, or if you're here because you do one already and you're trying to figure out if you want to pursue the other, let's start with the supplies that you need. There's a lot more variety with knitting needles than there are crochet hooks, and this can add up over time. With crocheting, I have the same pack of crochet hooks that I got when I first started crocheting or learned to crochet over 3.5 years ago. I've only had to purchase a couple more hooks since I got this initial pack because I needed a few more sizes based on the yarn that I was using or the project that I was making. And the size of these hooks, you can obviously see that the width of these vary slightly. For some of you, you may already know this, but for those that don't, you can very clearly see that the width of these are all, or the circumference rather, is all very different. This one being the thickest, and I believe, yep, this blue one here is the smallest. And you can tell by the marking on that center handle. But you really just acquire more when you need a different size or if you lose a crochet hook in your couch, like I do frequently. They do have a couple of other varieties, like you could buy a light up hook, right? Like if you're like me and your husband likes to turn the lights off and play video games next to you, but you want to be knitting next to him and you can't see your stitches, you can use like a light up crochet hook. But otherwise, there really isn't as much variety as there is with knitting. So with knitting, you could have just 2 straight needles. You could also have interchangeable needles, which is basically working it around in different cables, different cable lengths depending on the circumference, right? So if this sweater that I'm wearing right now, the cable would be a different length for if I were doing the body than it were if I were doing the sleeve, for example. So you have those 2. Then you also have the option of doing double pointed needles. I know these are still in the packaging, but they basically are pointed on either side of those and they create a circumference. So they're for those smaller rounds, like you could use them for a sleeve, like a smaller sleeve than this. You could use it for a sock. It just makes it a little less cumbersome to be knitting in a round, but I'll leave it at that for now. On a similar note, you have shorties. This makes knitting in a round easier. Still has cables, but it just, those lengths you can see are clearly much shorter than this option here as well. You also have different materials. You have wooden needles. You also have these, which are metal. So and each one of those are also a different size, right? So you could get a metal set if you like metal more. If you can get a wooden set if you like wooden more. You could have the option of straight knitting needles in every one of these sizes as well. So really, you can see that as you begin to knit more things or expand the types of things that you are making, you're probably going to buy many more things. So for example, this pack didn't have a 2.5 millimeter. It only went down to 3.5. I actually broke my 3.5 because that's why it's missing. So I had to then go buy a 2.5. There are packs that come with all of these supplies in one. You can get, they're a little bit more expensive if you want to get the interchangeable sets that have the full length and the smaller ones as well, but you might just have to buy them one off as well. So again, that's why it can really add up over time. Those are really the primary differences in tools. There are a lot of other tools that are still required with crocheting and knitting that are actually the same. So for example, you're still going to want a pair of scissors to cut your ends off when you're finished with your project or when you're finished with a certain section or color. You'll still probably want stitch markers so that you know where you might need to do a stitch increase if you're changing shape, or if you're going to do a different color, you can make that mark so you know when you're going to come back to it, or the beginning or end of your round. Yarn needles, so you can weave in those ends that you just cut off. Knitting though, they typically, ones that have that curved edge are a little bit better, but all to say, you'll still want a yarn needle to weave in those edges. You'll probably want a flimsy measuring tape. There's other means that you can measure, but so that you know how many rows are how many inches or centimeters, or how many stitches or how many centimeters or inches, depending on your metric. So this way you can scale it to either your body size, or if you want to make a miniature or a bigger version of maybe like a purse you're making, whatever the case may be, that's just how you can scale it, by knowing your gauge. Those are really the basics. There are a couple of other things you can get along the way, some other accessories, if you will. For example, if you make a garment either crocheting or knitting, or even just whatever item, and you want to block it, meaning you want to stretch it to size so that it will rest in that position and kind of hang out there, you might want this blocking board. Again, you could use that for both. Typically, if you buy a more natural fiber yarn, it might come in the form of a hank, which is kind of like a twisted pretzel, and those ends are held within it. So they don't have just flimsy ends that you can immediately pull from and begin your project. You would have to put it into a usable ball, or it's called a cake, kind of looks like a cake, to be able to begin your project. So in that case, you would use a yarn swift, which expands that hank and puts it into a loop so you can start pulling from, and then a yarn winder so you can start building up that ball or that cake. There are a couple of other accessories that you can get along the way. All to say, these are really the ones I mentioned: the knitting needles or the crochet hooks, and then your stitch markers, your yarn needles, your scissors. Those are really your core of what you're going to need. And I will reiterate, knitting can be more expensive. If you want to get a bulk of these products or of these tools all up front, knitting will be more expensive. If you acquire them over time, knitting will probably be more expensive. I haven't sought out any more expensive crochet hook. The ones that I bought the first crochet are the ones that I have stayed with, and the ones that I have bought were metal. They haven't broken on me. They've been very reliable, and they were maybe, I don't know, no more than $6 to $12 when I first purchased them. Whereas with knitting, I have gone through several different packs and types of knitting needles, obviously, because I have acquired all of those. In addition to the conversation of cost, we want to obviously touch on yarn. Yarn is a big factor in terms of affordability. To sum up what I will expand on in a moment, the cost really depends on the types of things that you're going to make. So for example, with crocheting, and I will get to this in a moment, the variety of items that you can make with crochet is much more varied than what you can make with knitting. And it's much more quick too. It also uses much more yarn. However, you don't necessarily need or have to use the expensive stuff. You don't have to do that with knitting either, but I'll get to that in a second. But with crocheting, you can make stuffed animals, you can make purses, you can make decorations for your house, pillows, blankets, very quickly. You can make koozies for a can of Coke. You could make purses and bags. For a lot of those types of things, I tend to use acrylic yarn. This blanket is acrylic. My pillows that I have that I'm not showing now, they're acrylic. Acrylic can tend to be softer than some of the other natural fibers, and it's much more affordable. You also use a lot more yarn with crocheting. Choosing a more affordable yarn, but you're using more of it, of course that could equate to if you were just to use like a more expensive yarn. And when I say more expensive yarns, we're talking your merino wools, we're talking your silk blends, or you can buy cashmere, you could buy alpaca. There's just a lot of different natural fibers. You could still use all those types of materials for crocheting. Now with knitting though, yes, you can still make bags and purses and stuffed animals. However, it tends to take longer. And I would say you can't necessarily like whip out a new shape as quickly. Like it's very easy to make a round or like build kind of like a 3D structure with crocheting. Because you're using up more yarn, you're definitely giving your item a much more structured fit. So even if I were to make a garment, which I'll show you the difference between a crochet, more closely, my crochet sweater, my knit sweater, it's less drapey, it's more thick, so you can basically build off that and make more shapes. With knitting though, definitely it tends to lean more wearable, heavy. You can make those really nice stuffed animals. They look timeless, they look elegant. But with that in mind, if you're going to be making more wearables with knitting, and crochet is definitely much more varied, the wearables is definitely dependent on personal preference. So the yarn that you use for those might tend to lean more toward natural fibers. I say this because I have made wearables with acrylic yarn, and it's not very breathable, but it is very warm. I crocheted this shirt for my husband, and I think it's really cool. It's some of my best work. It was some of my earliest work. 7 months into learning to crochet, I just kind of freehanded this, but it's made out of acrylic yarn. It was kind of a scrap project. And even though it has this granny stitch and it has these holes in it, it's heavy, and you can kind of see how thick that really is. I mean, if I were to weigh this, I probably be at least 3 pounds is what I would guess. When he wears it, it's because this is acrylic yarn, it really is not very breathable. So even though it has these holes, it makes him sweat. It'd be a great piece for like the beach or the spring or, but you can't really wear it. So I do tend to lean more towards natural fibers. Now, if I were to remake that, I would choose a cotton yarn, especially because of the season that I would be making it. I probably wouldn't choose a wool, but those can be more expensive yarns. So like I said, if I'm making more wearables with knitting, I'm probably going to choose more natural fibers because they're more breathable and I'm going to be having them on my skin. They can be itchier, acrylic can be more soft, but again, I really care about more not feeling like I'm sweating and not smelling. And I don't want it to retain the smell too, because at the same time, you want to be able to wash them delicately. So you can wear them a couple of times before you have to wash them. So that would be something to consider. So with that in mind, those costs can be pretty equitable if we're thinking less yarn used for knitting projects, but more expensive yarns used based on that breathability factor, versus more yarn used because crochet uses up more yarn, but you're using more affordable, probably acrylic-based yarns because of the variety of items that you can make. I want to say I did also look it up. If we're just looking at their standard, most basic form of stitches, you have a single crochet stitch, which I don't have an example with me, but that's probably like crocheting in its most basic standard form is a single crochet stitch compared to a stockinette stitch, which is basically just like a knit stitch. These little V's, basically this would be an example, like those little V's, crocheting could use about 40% more yarn. So just to put that into perspective of how much more yarn is used. Now, when we're thinking back to those sweaters that I showed you, this is the crochet sweater. So this sweater is one that I actually designed. It's called the Cozy Cropped Cardigan. I want to preface that there are so many different types of crochet sweaters that you can make. Like I'll get into, there are tons of different stitches that you can use or make in crocheting, and different varieties of stitches too that you can combine together. This one in particular, this stitch is called the yarn over back loop only slip stitch, and the trim is made from doing back loop only slip stitches. Now it's interesting because in the crocheting community, if you know, when people buy my pattern, they're often confused and being like, you made this out of all slip stitches? Like, I could never. I had someone commented on one of my TikTok videos that basically said, wow, you're braver than the Marines for doing an entire sweater in slip stitches. To that I say, you're not a knitter, clearly, because knitting takes so much longer, okay? But something that I do want to call out is, so these little V's, as you can see here, are very similar to the knit stitch and these V's here. However, this you can see is much drapier than this, which is very, very thick. And like I said, crocheting uses much more yarn than knitting does. There is a technique in knitting that can sort of replicate this look, and that's double knitting, which is basically kind of doing 2 layers on either side to get this look. If you guessed that this sweater was the knit sweater, then you were correct. As I've already said, the plum sweater was my crochet sweater. This one is my knit sweater. So like I mentioned, crocheting cannot be replicated by a machine, but knitting can, which makes it, you know, that might either appeal to you or be something that you maybe don't care about. So knitting, you can typically find like a knit top in stores, versus crocheting probably is not real crochet unless you go to a designer and they're paying a pretty high price for it. So I want to show you, this is a folded 2x2 ribbed collar, but so is this sweater that I've been wearing, but it's very similar style to the one that I've made here. It's very interesting. I've seen on some people's videos being like, pro, it looks store-bought, con, it also looks store-bought. It doesn't have that maybe like handmade look. You know, someone was joking about like, you know, now you're finally wearing one of your handmaids or your new knits in public and no one's complimenting you to say, hey, I love your sweater, and you don't have the opportunity to say, I made that. Because it looks store-bought, people aren't assuming that you made it, versus in crocheting, you know, if you know, this person probably made that. So as I briefly touched on too, crocheting goes much more quickly than knitting does. And of course it depends on the type of item that you're making. So if we're just looking at sweater to sweater, crochet sweater would take me less time than if I were to reknit this knit sweater. But again, it could be like, it depends on the complexity. If you're doing color work or very ornate projects, or if you're trying to make an entire blanket in single crochet stitch, it's not going to go very fast. If you're also using a bigger yarn, that's going to go more quickly than if you're using, this is a sock weight yarn that's very, very small, and I'm making an entire shirt out of it. I've already spent probably 3 weeks trying to make this, and this is how far I've gotten. Versus in crocheting, I could probably do this in probably half the time. And that would not be the case with the crochet. This would be much, much thicker if I were to crochet something similar to this. What looks better? What feels better? Like I mentioned, crochet is much more thick and dense, and knitting is much more drapey and thinner. I have really enjoyed knitting as of late. I'm really in like a knitting mode, and I tend to like the way that knitting looks better. It doesn't necessarily have that handmade feel, but that could be a pro and a con, right? Oh, this looks so great and it looks store-bought, but also it looks store-bought. Crocheting cannot be replicated with a machine, which is very cool. And if you do come across things that are like crochet style in stores, it's probably not real crochet. They're probably ripping off the people that actually did crochet it, if it is true crochet, and probably not paying them a fair wage, because it does take quite a bit of time. There are also, you might see designer bags, like I did a replica of a Miu Miu beach bag. Prada, I think, also has a tiny little crochet purse. Those are likely real crochet and probably be more like a couple $100 versus the $2,000-$3,000 that they might charge for it. If I had to choose between my crochet sweater and my knit sweater though, honestly, I would choose my knit sweater. And I hate saying that because I didn't design the knit sweater and I did design the crochet sweater, but it is true. It drapes better. I picked better yarn for it. I just like the look of it. I think it's much more timeless. I think crochet can sometimes be a very specific point in time. Like again, the 70s, granny square style. It's very specific. Now, if this was helpful and now you're considering starting either to learn how to crochet or learn how to knit, I want to share with you a little bit about what helped me. I started crocheting first, and I did find this to be helpful because I did find that actually having crochet hooks on hand when I go to knit, if I drop a stitch to pull it back up, it's much easier to have a crochet hook on hand. I did find that tool to be helpful in knitting. The first thing that I did was look up just how to make a granny square. Just how to make a granny square. And I wanted to decide if this was something that I could do or if this was something that I wanted to do. And at that point I was like, this seems easy enough. I could probably do this. And I looked up what supplies I need. And again, like I showed you, those crochet hooks, the yarn needles, measuring tape, scissors, stitch markers, and I was off. $20, I had everything. First things you should really learn: how to make a foundation chain, how to do a single crochet, how to do a slip stitch, how to cast off. Pretty basic. I do have a YouTube video on my page of how to do those few things. Then I also looked up how to do a couple different types of granny squares. That also taught me how to do double crochet, how to turn and go a different direction, and that was really helpful. I made 3 different types of granny squares. My first granny square, if you can see it, is actually up my bulletin board over there as a memory of where I started. I then looked up how to make a tank top. At the time, I think it was in September, it was still a little bit warmer, so I looked up how to make a tank top, very basic. I think it was out of single crochets, and then I made it in the next, probably by within 4 days, I had an actual wearable. So don't get discouraged. Now that was my journey to crochet, and then I just kept building off of that, really leaning into YouTube. Knitting, very similarly. With knitting, I was much more interested in just knitting sweaters. So there was a really wonderful tutorial called the Step-by-Step Sweater by Florence Miller. She walks you how to do a knit swatch, which I have up there, how to do that stockinette stitch, which are a knit stitch and a purl stitch if you're just going one direction versus if you're knitting it around. You'll learn more about that. How to do a color change, and how to do ribbing. So like this versus this, pretty much. After she teaches you how to do those things, then you get into the sweater, how to do a turtleneck, then how to basically do increases and build it out into the arms, etc. She teaches you everything. So if you're just interested in learning how to make a sweater and you know, like me, see them all over TikTok and you wish that you could start, watch that video. You will learn everything and you will have a sweater by the end of it. It's wonderful. And very last piece of advice, I've said this in a couple of other videos, but don't be discouraged by what other people show on social media. It really does not take that long, or as long as you might think, to basically get to where some of these people are at, those that inspired you to want to start. It really does not take that long. I want to say that blue sweater that my knit sweater is the second thing I've ever knit. The first one was that step-by-step sweater. So again, just commit. You'll be on a roll in no time. If there's anything I didn't cover, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them below and I will keep an eye out, but I will see you in the next one.